In this lecture, we are going to take some time to look at the teacher's role in presuming competencies, whether it's intelligence or other abilities, regarding their students with disabilities. Let's explore what teachers are looking for. Most people, and this applies to teachers, most of us believe that any person with a disability has lower intelligence than non-disabled persons. Regardless of the disability, whether it be a physical disability, a sensory disability such as blindness or deafness, or learning issues, or even different speech patterns, chronic illnesses, and so on. The tendency is to presume they also have lower intelligence. Our job is to provide opportunities to expose the student to learning experiences. How do we do this? We must work from the assumption that the student with a disability is eager to learn, find their place in the world, and assert themselves. If the presumption is the student is unable to learn, cannot progress, what becomes of the student? They are prevented from participating in the world. We want the student to participate in the world. But if a fixed mindset determines the child has lower intelligence, then the consequence is that the child's participation will be limited. Your expectations of students matters. When there are no expectations set out for the student, then they don't perform well. Over the years, I have taught many deaf and hard of hearing students. Very often, their parents' expectations were low because they perceived their child to have an intellectual disability. What is, in fact, language deprivation can look like an intellectual disability. So parents' expectations are low. I have seen parents give their students a pass, don't require them to do homework, not insist the child take any responsibilities for themselves or around the house. Just let them spend time on whatever they want. It comes from a culture of low expectations for children with disabilities. It goes beyond the parents. Teachers, interpreters, teaching assistants harbor low expectations for their students too, though they never say that. But the student picks up on these vibes and will internalize them to their detriment. The severity of one's disability does not determine the level of potential. High expectations can help determine this level. The greatest barriers that persons with disabilities have to address have nothing to do with the inaccessibility of the physical environment. Steps versus ramps are not the main issue. Physical accommodations, the built environment, are the easiest barriers to resolve. The greatest barrier is societal expectations. If we have low expectations for our students, we will limit their potential forever. They become accustomed to these low expectations, and trying to change this mindset takes purposeful effort on the teacher's part. It's especially difficult when they're older. I had a grade 9 student move into my program for the first time. He wasn't prepared to do the work. He had already given up. His reading level was approximately grade 4, which sadly is common among profoundly deaf students. He wouldn't do homework. He fooled around a lot. He wouldn't pay attention. With such low expectations, you could see how it affected his behavior. He was immature. Even though he was 14, his emotional development was about that of a 5-year-old. Once he got into my class, he was shocked because now he was faced with high expectations, which over time led to a turnaround in all of his behaviors. Believe me, that wasn't easy. 9 years of schooling with low expectations and tolerance for inappropriate behavior took great effort and time to turn around. It seems to be in our DNA that we teachers observe our students and come out with a checklist of what they can and cannot do. That's a big mistake. One of the students I worked with had been coded as having an intellectual challenge. His elementary teacher told me that he was never able to learn how to add double-digit numbers. Well, okay. So when he got to my class, I did my own observations. What the teacher identified as an intellectual challenge was actually language deprivation. He couldn't hear the teacher well enough, so was missing the auditory language input. There was a sign language interpreter with him in elementary school, but they were just fluent, so the student was not getting any proper language exposure. He had severely limited expressive language. I was confident the student could and would be able to learn how to add double digits. I worked with him using ASL to improve his language fluency. We practiced. He was able to ask questions. I expected him to learn. It took time because he was language deprived. We had to start getting those language neurons stimulated, at which point he went back to the mainstream math class. You know me, I'm no math teacher. Back in math class, he was able to work with double-digit numbers, passed the class, and got the necessary credits for his high school diploma. High expectations got him there. To reiterate, it's important not to limit your expectations of students' competence. Measuring intelligence is very complicated. Intelligence is multi-layered. And it is certainly much more than doing well on any test. Intelligence is multifaceted, influenced by background, prior knowledge, language abilities, emotional and social development, exposure to world knowledge, literacy skills, and much more. So if a student does poorly on an intelligence test, it doesn't mean they have low intelligence. It could just mean we don't have the tools to find an accurate score. An IQ score does not tell me what a student can do and learn. An IQ score does not tell me what they can't do. These scores do not help me as a teacher. If these tests identify the student with a low score, implying the student can't learn and lacks abilities, then why are they sent to school? There is quite a body of research that has looked at the accuracy of IQ and other tests and have found them to be terribly flawed. It's pretty difficult to get accurate results regardless. IQ testing, scoring, and reports tend to highlight student weaknesses. I've had a number of confrontations with the educational psychologist in my former school division. Invariably, the deaf students are coded with an intellectual challenge. In one instance, I reached out to the psychologist and asked how they were going to communicate with the student during the testing. The response was that an interpreter would be brought in. I countered that the division interpreters are not trained, nor are they qualified to interpret for psychological testing. The psychologist justified the need for testing by saying the mainstream, non-signing teacher's observations of the student suggest an intellectual challenge. So my suggestion was to hold off the testing, and I would work with the student for a time, and later together the psychologist and I could determine the best course of action. Most deaf students coded for quote intellectual disabilities were placed in my classroom. But the true root cause of their learning challenges was language deprivation. It is true, though, language deprivation can look like an intellectual disability. In my class, we worked on language development in ASL. Most of them could neither speak nor sign intelligibly. They needed to be intensely engaged in fully accessible, receptive, and expressive language, participate in conversations, learn to express themselves. After a time, that student showed real growth. It finally hit home to that psychologist that it was more important to look at language deprivation and language development than intellectual challenges. Unfortunately, school administrators, principals, and other decision makers so often choose to put deaf students in placements with students with intellectual challenges. Since I left my position, it seems the policy is changing to suspend IQ testing for deaf students. In part because there are not appropriately trained interpreters, and because they don't have any fluent signing teachers of the deaf. I was the only one. But at least the message has gotten through that it's language deprivation, not low intelligence, that the students are presenting with. It shows us the educational system is still steeped in the deficit model of thinking. If students with disabilities have good instruction and high quality support, they can grow and be successful. We have to refrain from predicting a student's future and refrain from concluding what they can or can't do. What we predict they can't do will surely come to pass. You can limit their growth for the rest of their lives. Do you really want that kind of power? For students who have complex communication challenges and movement challenges, it's difficult to accurately assess IQ anyway. It shouldn't even be attempted. It's not worth anybody's time. A growing body of research of people who have been identified as severely disabled and with intellectual disabilities, in fact, were not. One of the most famous examples is Helen Keller. Born in the 1800s, she became fluent in reading and writing English. She did have language, though, before becoming ill and losing her sight and hearing. When people with intellectual disabilities have high quality instruction and are guided by effective strategies, they truly can grow. The point is, given the opportunity to communicate, students were able to demonstrate they were much more capable than previously thought. As mentioned before, your assumptions and decisions about a student's lack of competence can affect their future growth for life. If we set high expectations and were wrong about their ability, so what? there are pretty much no negative consequences. Maybe a bit of embarrassment for the teacher. That's okay. We make mistakes all the time. Get over it. Better to be wrong in overestimating competence because it does no harm. Assuming competence is the least dangerous assumption. The most dangerous assumption is not presuming competence. Our only true failure as teachers is if we give up, if we quote, quote, walk away because we assume lack of competence, if we assume no growth is possible. If we view our students from the deficit model, what negative, lasting repercussions does that have on our students with disabilities? It's called social devaluation. In ASL, I translate that to social death. That's what it means. Students can experience social death. There are more than 10,000 students with developmental disabilities in the system, including intellectual, emotional, or whatever the student's challenges in their non-typical development. We will fail them if we show social devaluation. Let's consider future prospects for this group of students. They are dehumanized. Their vulnerabilities are heightened. They are more likely to be abused or victims of violence. Our students with disabilities are 3 times more likely to experience lifelong poverty compared to their peers. Stats show they are 70 to 80% more likely to be unemployed. What are these students going to do? Stay at home? Live with their parents? How can they find employment? We all know that work provides self-esteem and a sense of purpose. Often, lack of employment leads to a sense of worthlessness. Persons with disabilities are 4 to 10 times more likely to be victims of violence, abuse, or neglect. Children with disabilities are more than 2 times as likely to be physically or sexually abused. Persons with disabilities experience pervasive loneliness. Let's go back to that concept of social death. Please think about whether your actions demonstrate social devaluation. Truly, it's the same as murdering someone's soul.